The Duke returned 5 years later to his country house, only to find a ghost inside. The fog came in off the moor before the carriage reached the gates, and by the time Pedro Thornfield stepped down onto the drive, Ravenscroft Hall had ceased to be a building and become something older, a shape pressed into the darkness, 3 stories of blackened limestone dissolving at the edges into October and cloud. He stood with his lantern raised and said nothing, because there was no one to say anything to. He had not written ahead. He had not told the solicitor, had not told his secretary, had not told a living soul that tonight was the night he had finally run out of continent to put between himself and this place. The decision had come at him sideways at 4 a.m. in a Calais boarding house, not as resolution, but as exhaustion. 5 years was long enough. Longer than long enough. The gates were rusted open. He walked through them. Before I continue, click the subscribe button, likes, and share. Tell us where you are chatting from in the comment sections. The drive was eaten through with weeds, the gravel long since surrendered to grass that reached his boot tops and soaked through before he had taken 20 steps. He noted this without feeling it. He noted everything without feeling it. It was the one useful thing the last 5 years had taught him, to move through information like water through stone, taking nothing in, leaving no impression. The hall rose before him, and the fog thickened, and there was nothing. Dark windows, cold chimneys. The ivy had taken the east face almost entirely, and the great oak beside the south gate had split down the middle from some winter lightning strike he would never know the date of. It was, in short, exactly what he had come to find. Empty. Finished. Ready to be signed away and released. He raised the lantern to find his key. And then he saw it. Upper floor. 3rd window from the north end. The room that had been hers. Light. Not candlelight, not the amber flicker of a forgotten sconce. Something paler than that. Something that sat inside the glass rather than behind it, the way moonlight sits in still water, sourceless and complete. And within it, framed by the dark of the surrounding stone as precisely as a portrait in its frame, a figure. White. Still. Arms at her sides. Face turned toward the courtyard below. Toward him. Pedro's lantern guttered. The flame bent sideways in a wind that did not touch him anywhere else, against any other surface, and then straightened, and the figure did not move, did not shift, did not do anything except stand in that pale, impossible light, and look down at the man standing in the ruined drive with his key in his hand, and 5 years of careful nothing beginning to come apart at the seams. He had survived cannon fire. He had survived betrayal of the sort that rearranges a man's understanding of his own species. He had survived the worst thing he had ever done. His hand was trembling. He went inside. The door was not locked. He had expected resistance, a bolt, a barricade, some physical evidence of occupation, but the handle turned cleanly, and the room opened before him the way rooms do when they belong to someone who has nothing to hide, which was, Pedro would reflect later, either the most reassuring or the most alarming quality a trespasser could possess. She was at the window. Her back was to him, white nightgown, dark hair unbound, one hand flat against the glass, and for the 3 seconds it took his lantern light to reach the corners of the room and confirm the solid, breathing reality of her, Pedro's mind did something it had not done since the battlefield. It went completely blank. Then she turned. She was not Lucy. She was younger than the ghost stories had shaped in his imagination and older than fear, and she did not scream. One hand went to her throat, the single involuntary thing, and then it came down again, and her chin came up, and she looked at him across the width of Lucy Winslow's room with the composed, measuring expression of a woman who had already calculated her options and selected the best one. "Who are you?" she said. The question was so entirely the wrong way around that something almost broke loose in Pedro's chest. "I am Pedro Thornfield," he said, "Duke of Ravenscroft. I think the more pressing question belongs to me." Something moved behind her eyes, not fear. Recognition. The specific, bracing recognition of a moment long anticipated and now, finally, arrived. "You were not expected until next week," she said. The solicitor's letter said. I don't answer to my solicitor's letters." He stepped further into the room. She did not retreat. "Who are you, and what are you doing in this house?" "Keeping it standing." The simplicity of it hit him harder than an argument would have. Caroline Thornfield, Thomas's wife. She let that register, watching his face for the flicker, finding it. "I have been in residence for 2 years. I pay the maintenance accounts through Pritchard's office. The east wing roof was retiled last November. Without it, the upper corridor would have flooded through by spring. The dairy runs at modest profit. The ledgers are current and available for your inspection at any hour you choose." Pedro said nothing. "I have every receipt," she added, with the precision of a woman who has rehearsed this exact sentence and is not remotely embarrassed about it. From the dressing room adjoining, a sound. Small, fractious, half asleep. A child's voice surfacing briefly from the deep water of sleep and submerging again. Pedro looked at the doorway, then back at her. She had not moved, but something in her had shifted, a readiness, subtle and absolute, the way a door shifts in its frame before it opens. "One night," Pedro said. "Tomorrow we speak properly." "Thank you, Your Grace." Her voice was steady as stone. He left before it could become anything else. He had intended to be gone before they woke. That had been the plan formed somewhere between the groundskeeper's narrow bed and the gray edge of dawn. Rise early. Take coffee if the kitchen had any. Leave a note for Caroline Thornfield instructing her to have Thomas present by afternoon, and remove himself to the village until the conversation could be conducted on terms that felt less like ambush. It was a clean plan, a sensible plan. The kind of plan a man makes when he has spent 5 years perfecting the architecture of his own detachment. He came downstairs to find the kitchen already lit and warm, bread already on the griddle, and a child already at the table. The boy was perhaps 4 years old. He sat with his legs dangling well clear of the floor, both hands wrapped around a cup of something warm. A wooden soldier standing sentinel beside his elbow. He was still in his nightshirt. His hair had not been introduced to a comb this morning or, by the evidence, any recent morning. He watched Pedro come through the kitchen doorway with an expression of complete, untroubled interest, the way small children watch the world before the world has taught them that some things are worth being afraid of. Pedro stopped. The boy had dark eyes. Not simply dark in a way that many children's eyes are dark, the generic, undifferentiated darkness of early childhood that lightens and shifts and eventually becomes something else. These were particular, specific, a deep, clear brown with a quality of directness in them that went straight through pretense and landed somewhere uncomfortably close to the truth. Lucy Winslow's eyes. Pedro knew them because he had spent 5 years not thinking about them, which meant they were among the most precisely preserved details in his memory, catalogued and sealed in the part of his mind he did not open, retrieved now, without his permission, with the absolute fidelity of things we try hardest to forget. He said nothing. "You stayed," the boy said. Not accusatory, simply observational, in the manner of someone logging data. "I stayed," Pedro agreed. The boy considered this, apparently satisfied, and took a sip from his cup. Pedro moved to the stove, found the coffee, found a cup, and did the small mechanical things that the hands do when a mind has gone somewhere it cannot be followed. Behind him, he heard Caroline's step on the stair, light, quick, already braced, and then the particular quality of her silence when she entered and found him already there, already standing 3 feet from her son with his back to the room, and his shoulders carrying something she could not yet name. Pedro did not turn around. He drank his coffee. He listened to the child hum something tuneless and contented to his wooden soldier. He thought about the drive to the village in the sensible plan, the clean exit. He did not move toward the door. He told himself it was a practical matter. Before any conversation with Thomas, before any decision about the estate's future, before anything else could be determined, he needed to know the condition of the property. This was the reasonable, ducal, entirely unsentimental reason he lifted his coat from the hook by the back door after breakfast and walked out into the pale October morning with no destination other than his own grounds. An inspection, nothing more. The kitchen garden stopped him first. It should have been a ruin. 5 years of no dedicated staff, no instruction, no funding directed toward anything so low in the hierarchy of estate priorities as a kitchen garden. It should have gone to weed and stone. Instead, it ran in neat, productive rows along the south-facing wall, the late-season brassicas still standing, the herb beds cut back with the particular precision of someone who understood not just that plants needed tending, but why. Someone had repointed the garden wall. Someone had replaced the broken cold frame with new timber, fitted snugly, painted against the weather. Pedro stood at the gate for a long moment and said nothing to no one. The dairy was worse meaning better, meaning more damning. 2 cows, clean stalls, fresh lime-washed walls, a churn that had been repaired and refinished. A production ledger hung on a nail by the door, every entry in Caroline's small, exact hand, every figure accounted for, the modest quarterly surplus noted without comment or pride, simply recorded as fact. He read 3 months' worth of entries standing in the doorway, with the cold coming off the flagstones through his boot soles, and felt something in the region of his sternum begin a slow, uncomfortable process he could not have named. The east wing roof was next. He climbed to the upper corridor and stood beneath the new timber and fresh slate that had replaced. He could see the line where old met new, a section that must have been catastrophic by the time Caroline's mason got to it. She had not written to him about it, had not sent the bill to his solicitor's office, had simply found the money from the estate's modest dairy surplus and the kitchen garden's yield and whatever arrangement she had with Pritchard, and fixed the roof of a house that did not belong to her because the alternative was watching it die. He found the ledgers last, stacked in his state office in an order so meticulous it was almost reproachful. 5 years of accounts, the early ones thin and desperate, the later ones steadier. Each year's record a document of incremental rescue performed without acknowledgement or audience. His mother had told him the estate was beyond recovery. Stripped. The good furniture sold, the tenants gone, the accounts irretrievable. Every surface he touched told him something different. Someone had been here the entire time, saving what he had walked away from, and they had never once asked him to notice. He heard the horse before he saw the rider. Pedro was in the estate office, the ledgers still open before him, when the sound of hooves on the drive brought him to the window. The rider came through the gates at a controlled canter and pulled up before the hall's entrance with the ease of a man who had done it 10,000 times, which Pedro supposed he had. Thomas Winslow had been coming to Ravenscroft Hall since he was 12 years old, trailing behind his sister, carrying her books. Pedro was in the foyer when Thomas came through the door. 5 years had changed him in the way that difficulty changes men who refuse to be destroyed by it. Leaner, quieter, something behind the eyes that had not been there at 26. He was travel-dusty, and he had ridden hard, and he stopped when he saw Pedro, and the two of them stood on opposite sides of the foyer's cold flagstone floor, and did not speak. Pedro had prepared words for this. Somewhere on the road from Calais, he had assembled a series of sentences, measured, ducal, appropriately grave, that acknowledged the irregular situation, established his authority over the estate, and moved efficiently toward resolution. They were good sentences. They dissolved completely in the silence of the foyer and left nothing behind. Thomas looked at him for a long moment, not with the expression Pedro had been bracing for, not fury, not accusation, not the particular contempt of a man whose grievance is 5 years old and therefore all the more precisely sharpened. He looked at Pedro the way a man looks at something he has been waiting to deal with for a very long time and is now, finally, ready to deal with. He reached inside his coat and produced a leather document case, worn at the corners, the strap fastened, with the careful attention of something that had been opened and closed many times. He crossed the foyer and held it out. Pedro took it. "Read it here," Thomas said. His voice was even. "I'll wait." Pedro undid the strap. The first document was a letter in his mother's hand, her precise, elegant, irrefutable hand, addressed to a midwife in the village of Hallows Crossing, and dated 5 years and 3 months ago. He read the first paragraph, and something cold moved through him that had nothing to do with the October air coming under the hall's front door. He read the midwife's signed confession next, then the second letter, then the third. He was aware, distantly, of Thomas standing at the foyer's edge, watching him with the stillness of a man who has carried something heavy for a very long time and has just set it down. Pedro reached the last document. He read it twice. Then he stood with the papers in his hands and looked at nothing in particular for what felt like a long time, and was probably 30 seconds. "She's here," he said. It was not a question. "She's here," Thomas said. Thomas had told him which room. Third door on the Upper East Corridor, the one with the repaired window latch. Caroline had fixed it herself last spring because the original mechanism had rusted through, and she had not wanted Lucy to feel confined by a window that would not open. Thomas had said this without emphasis, the way he said most things now, and Pedro had nodded and gone downstairs and stood in the kitchen for 3 minutes staring at the cold grate before he picked up the iron poker, identified that the grate did not actually need attention, set the poker down, and went to find something that did. The east wing flue had been bothering him since Caroline mentioned it 2 days ago. It was a straightforward problem. A damper plate warped off its seating, causing the smoke to backdraft into the third bedroom rather than draw cleanly up the stack. He found the tools in the groundskeeper's shed, found the problem exactly where he had expected it, and spent an hour in the cold fireplace with soot on his coat and both arms in the flue working the plate back to true. It was precise, physical, and entirely absorbing. It was, he recognized without examining the recognition too closely, exactly the kind of task a man performs when he is not ready to do the thing he is supposed to be doing. He rehung the broken garden gate after that. Then split wood for the kitchen pile until the pile was higher than it needed to be by any reasonable calculation. Caroline watched him from the kitchen doorway at one point, not speaking, not intervening, simply standing with a cup of tea, warming her hands, and the particular quality of attention that was, he had come to understand, her primary language. She was taking his measure. He did not object. Whatever she concluded, she had earned the right to conclude it. By evening the hall was warmer than it had been. Pedro was in the groundskeeper's room, reading nothing in particular, when the knock came. Small, knuckle-light, the authoritative knock of someone who has not yet learned that knocking is supposed to be tentative. Edmund opened the door before Pedro answered it. He was in his nightshirt again, the wooden soldier in one hand and a book in the other, battered, the cover soft with use, the kind of book that has been read aloud so many times it falls open of its own accord. He held it out with the directness that characterized every interaction Pedro had witnessed him initiate. "Mama has a headache," Edmund said. "She said I might ask." Pedro looked at the book, at the boy standing in his doorway with Lucy's eyes and Thomas's jawline, and an expression of complete, patient confidence that the answer would be yes. He had not sat still in 5 years. He moved over on the narrow bed, and Edmund climbed up, and Pedro opened the book and began to read. She was in the kitchen garden. He had known for 2 days which room she occupied, which corridor she used, approximately what hours she moved through the house. Not because he had asked, but because a man trained in military intelligence cannot stop his own mind from mapping the information that reaches him, and information about Lucy reached him constantly now, in the form of Caroline's careful silences and Thomas's measured sentences, and Edmund's unguarded chatter about what Mama had said, and where Mama had gone, and what Mama thought about the frost coming in off the moor. He had found reasons not to be in any room she was likely to enter. He ran out of reasons on the third morning. She was at the far end of the kitchen garden cutting back the dead canes of a rosemary hedge, and she did not hear him on the path because the wind was coming off the moor at an angle that carried sound away from her, and so he had 3 seconds of seeing her before she knew he was there, 3 seconds that he would spend a long time afterwards wishing he could give back, because they were enough. Then she turned. Whatever he had prepared, and he had prepared nothing, which was its own kind of preparation, left him entirely. She looked at him with an expression that had no performance in it whatsoever, which was the most frightening thing he had encountered in 5 years, including the cannon fire, and then she set down her shears with the deliberate care of a woman who is making a considered decision about what her hands should be doing, and she said, "I wondered when you would stop rearranging the woodpile and come and find me." "Lucy, don't. Not loud. Absolute. Don't say my name like that yet. You haven't earned that yet." He stopped. "You knew." Her voice was level in the way that deep water is level, the stillness of something with tremendous weight below it. "The night she came. The night her carriage was in the drive, and I waited for you, and you didn't. You knew what she was there to do, and you said nothing." "Yes," Pedro said. She had been expecting argument. He saw it in the fractional shift of her stance, the bracing for a defense that did not come. The single syllable landed differently than fury would have, and for a moment neither of them spoke. "I told myself it was mercy," he said, "that you would be spared the scandal, the exposure." He paused. "I have had 5 years to understand what I was actually sparing myself." The wind moved through the dead rosemary canes between them. "I have a son," Pedro said. "I have spent 4 days watching him, and I cannot—" He stopped. Began again. "I don't know how to ask for what I have no right to ask for." Lucy looked at him for a long time. "I know," she said finally. "That's the first honest thing you've ever said to me." The carriage arrived at 10 in the morning, which was, Pedro reflected, entirely characteristic. His mother had always believed that the morning belonged to people who intended to win. He was in the estate office when he heard the wheels on the drive, the specific weight and rhythm of a well-sprung traveling carriage, not a hired vehicle, the kind of conveyance that announces its owner's resources before the door has opened. He was at the window in time to see the Ravenscroft crest on the door panel catch the pale October light, and something in his chest performed the old familiar contraction, the one that had governed most of his decisions between the ages of 14 and 29. He noted it. He did not move toward the door. Caroline appeared in the office doorway 30 seconds later. "She has a solicitor," she said. "And a magistrate." "Yes," Pedro said. "She would." Thomas was behind her, the leather document case already in his hand, and the look that passed between husband and wife was the compressed, efficient communication of people who have planned for exactly this contingency and are now, without drama, enacting it. Pedro went to the front entrance. His mother descended from the carriage with the unhurried precision of a woman who has never once needed to rush because the world has always arranged itself to wait for her. She was dressed for consequence, charcoal traveling clothes, her late husband's mourning brooch at her throat, every detail calibrated to project the specific authority of a dowager duchess conducting legitimate and regrettable business. The solicitor followed. The magistrate followed. They arranged themselves at the base of the steps in a formation that had the quality of a prepared argument. She looked up at Pedro, and her expression did what it always did, composed itself into something that was almost warmth and was actually the complete absence of uncertainty. "Pedro." A pause calibrated to suggest both affection and disappointment. "You might have written." "So might you," Pedro said. "For 5 years. Something shifted minimally behind her eyes. She climbed the steps and held out a document bearing her seal. "This is a trespass claim," she said, with the gentle matter-of-factness of someone explaining the weather. "The individuals occupying the East Corridor have no legal standing on this property. The magistrate is here to oversee their removal. I think you will find everything in order." "I'm certain you do," Pedro said. He took the document. He did not read it. Behind him, Thomas stepped forward and held out the leather case to the solicitor. Not to his mother, Pedro noted, but to the solicitor, which was the kind of precise, considered move that 5 years of preparation produces. "You will want to read those," Thomas said, "before anyone determines what is in order." The solicitor took the case. Pedro's mother looked at it the way a general looks at unexpected weather, the first fractional sign that the terrain has not behaved as the maps described. The solicitor read for 7 minutes. Pedro counted them against the silence of the foyer, the magistrate standing to one side with the careful neutrality of a man who has begun to suspect he has been brought somewhere under false pretenses, Caroline on the stair with her hands folded, Thomas beside the door with the stillness of someone who has waited 5 years for 7 minutes and can manage them without difficulty. His mother stood at the foyer center and did not read. She did not need to. She had written most of what was in that case, and the rest she had commissioned, and she was utterly certain Pedro could see the certainty on her, worn as comfortably as the mourning brooch. That certainty itself would be sufficient. It had always been sufficient before. She had built her entire life on the reliable architecture of other people's willingness to yield. The solicitor looked up. "Your Grace," he said, and it took Pedro a moment to understand the man was addressing him and not his mother, which was itself a shift in the room's weather. "These documents, if they are authentic—" "They are authenticated," Thomas said. "The midwife's confession was witnessed by 2 magistrates in Hallows Crossing. The dates on the dowager's letters predate the death certificate by 11 days. The certificate is a forgery. The signatures can be compared." The magistrate cleared his throat and held out his hand for the case. Pedro's mother moved then, not toward the documents but toward Pedro, which was the older strategy, the one that had always worked better than paperwork. "You do not understand what you are doing," she said, her voice dropping to the register she reserved for private recalibration. "The scandal alone will." "Lucy Winslow is alive," Pedro said. Not loudly. Loudly was never the point. "She is in this house. She has been in this house for 2 years under the protection of her brother because you arranged her disappearance and falsified her death to conceal a fact that threatened your management of this estate and this title." He paused. "The fact being that she is the mother of my son." The word son in the foyer of Ravenscroft Hall, spoken aloud for the first time, did something to the air that Pedro felt in his back teeth. "Edmund Thomas Thornfield," he said, "for the magistrate, for the solicitor, for the record that would be made of this morning. 4 years old. Born at Ravenscroft Hall. My heir." His mother's composure did not shatter. It was too well constructed for that. But something behind it shifted, the certainty first, replaced by calculation, and then the calculation failing to find purchase, and then something he had never once seen on her face in 29 years. She had not planned for a man who did not yield. The magistrate began to read. She had not planned for that either. The Dowager Duchess left at noon. There was no scene. Pedro had half expected one. His mother had always understood the strategic value of a final word, a door closed with precisely calibrated force, some gesture that reframed retreat as choice. Instead, she walked to her carriage with the magistrate's copy of Thomas's documents under the solicitor's arm and the particular straightness of spine that was, Pedro now understood, not dignity but its performance. She did not look back at the hall. She did not look at Pedro. The carriage moved down the drive, and the fog took it, and Ravenscroft Hall was quiet. Not the quiet had been when Pedro arrived. That had been the quiet of abandonment, a held breath, an empty room, the silence of something waiting to be finished. This was different. This was the quiet of a house that had just exhaled for the first time in 5 years, the silence of walls that had been holding a secret at considerable structural cost and had now, finally, been permitted to set it down. Pedro stood in the foyer for a moment. Then he went to find Lucy. She was in the kitchen garden again. He was beginning to understand that the kitchen garden was where she went when she needed to think in the same way he went to physical tasks, and that this was perhaps the first thing he had learned about her that was entirely new, untouched by the versions of her he had been carrying and misremembering for 5 years. She heard him on the path this time. She turned, and he stopped 6 feet from her, and he did not prepare anything, because preparation had not served him well in this garden, and he had run out of patience with his own defenses. "I am not going to sell the hall," he said. Lucy waited. "I am not going to ask you to stay as a tenant or a ward or under any arrangement that requires Thomas to stand between us as a condition of your safety." He paused. "I am asking you to stay because this house has been yours in every way that matters for 5 years, and I have been the absence at its center, and I would like, if you will permit it, to stop being absent." The wind moved through the rosemary. "That is not an answer to everything," Lucy said. "No," Pedro agreed. "It isn't. I have a considerable number of things still to earn. I'm aware of that." Something in her face shifted. Not forgiveness, not yet, but the thing that must exist before forgiveness becomes possible. The acknowledgement that the person in front of you is finally actually telling the truth. "Edmund will want breakfast early," she said. "He always does." "I know," Pedro said. "He told me." She almost smiled. It was brief, and it was careful, and it was, Pedro thought, the most valuable thing he had ever been given. He walked back to the hall beside her and went inside.